Hey, everybody. Hello. First, I'd just like to say, after a year and a half of not doing things like this, thank you so much for showing up. I appreciate it. I did a few virtual conferences. I did virtual All Things Open last year, and it was a great experience. But there's nothing like seeing people in real life. So I appreciate you coming out. Let's get to the talk. Urban legends: what your code makes you who you are. First, I of course have to say, I work at a company called Mattermost. Mattermost is a developer collaboration platform. We help you with, messaging, getting people together. We have GitLab integrations, GitHub integrations. We have a Kanban board, style board. You can do all this great stuff. Find out more. We're at the booth upstairs, right outside the keynote room. They pay me to say that. Let me tell you a little bit about me. So I am a developer advocate. I'm actually the head of developer relations now at Mattermost. Been doing this for a while. But beyond that, I'm a dad. I'm lucky enough I get to travel the world and see people and talk about code and technology everywhere. I've also been a drummer since I was 6 years old. I'm a musician. And one time, I always include this picture. One time I let my, at the time, 11-year-old keynote RubyConf. And if you ever want to know true terror, bring an 11-year-old child with you up on stage for 45 minutes in front of professional developers. It's just fun. But that's me. Let's talk a little bit about what the talk is about. So the main focus of this talk is kind of threefold. There's a lot of misconceptions about the programming languages we use, the tools that we use, that one thing is better than another, that there's some sort of golden hammer that's going to solve all of our problems. And even that being like well-versed in any one particular technology or area of technology makes you a better person or a superior developer or superior ops person. Some of these come from the communities that we identify with, and others come from the communities that spawned us. And then finally, there's kind of some perceptions that we've dealt with for a long time that kind of show the difference between being an open source developer versus an enterprise developer. I'm going to talk about those a little bit as well. One thing that we're not going to talk about, in case you saw the title and you thought it was going to be cool, we're not going to discuss cryptozoology. We're not going to talk about actual urban legends, which I'm sure there are some. I had a great talk about haunted houses with the guy at the Major League Hacking booth because I'm from Buffalo, New York. He's headed up there to see haunted houses. Apparently, we have 10 of them. No one told me. I should probably move. But there's going to be no Tyler Durdens. There's going to be no capoeiras, or not cap. What are they called? Chupacabras. Capoeira is a real thing. No unicorns. None of that stuff in this talk. But we're going to get to the real part right soon. So I'm going to start with Ruby. How many of you have done Ruby before? Ruby's a fun language. I love Ruby. I still to this day love Ruby. I don't code it in every day, but when I do get to code it, I'm pretty happy. And there's lots of people who on the outside who still think Ruby is this tiny baby language for hipsters. You build silly apps that don't make any sense. And why do people get that impression? And to be honest, it's partially because of Rails. Many people who don't know much about Ruby or the community basically know about Rails. Specifically because it is led by a fairly vibrant and mouthy person who is in charge of all of it, a guy named Dave. And that's cool, but there's also a lot to Rails that actually help the Ruby community grow. Things like scaffolding, easy setup. You used to say, get 90% of the work done in 10% of the time. And so a lot of startups still use Ruby heavily because it does things automagically, which is nice. I hate that word, but it's kind of nice to have it. One click, your whole project is there, throw some CSS, some style on it, bam, done, pay me $1 million. And that's cool. But the key thing to remember is that Ruby and Rails are not the same thing. Ruby can be a very powerful language to build applications for the desktop, to build applications for mobile. You don't need Rails. Even if you're just building web applications, you can build with frameworks other than Rails. Like there's Hanami, which used to be called Lotus. There's Sinatra if you're building a simple app without too many end users. There's lots of things you can do, but Ruby still has this attitude of like, it's not that useful. So let this one sink in for a sec. This is an old comic that I found back when I was in the Ruby community. And it was taken from a blog post that wanted to claim that only enterprise software development was good and that open source was dead. I found this is a blog post from 8 years ago. And these people still very much hold this point of view. There's some truth to it. People think that, you do Ruby, so you're probably just building some app that finds, single source espresso in Soma, and you're living in San Francisco and you're making all this money and you make a bunch of self-serving, worthless crap. That's what Ruby's for, right? To get to, the MVP and just try to collect as much money as you can. And, everyone wears a beard and a hat. And so this is the hard part for me because I do wear a beard. I do always wear a hat, but that's not the point. The point is that it's not just a thing. Like the attitude that Ruby is just for hobbyists or that people only make garbage apps, it's a myth. It's an urban legend and it's ridiculous. Lots of companies are still using Ruby daily to build high quality applications. I'm just saying, like there's a lot of companies that are using Ruby daily to build a lot of great applications. Even, GitHub is still primarily using Ruby on the back end. Netflix is built on Ruby. Urban Dictionary, which is something I go to every day because I have teenage college age kids and they say things that I don't know what they mean. I have to figure that out. So luckily there's a Rails app out there that tells me. So that's Ruby. We all know about Ruby. Let's talk about the elephant in the room, because whenever you talk about Ruby, you of course have to talk about PHP. How many people have used PHP before? Yeah, everybody. So first off, let's dispel the rumor. Back when I was heavily into Ruby, there was this thing going around saying like, oh, Rubyists and the PHP community, they just don't get along. There's lots of things that sparked this. Like PHP had Symfony as a framework. It's an MVC framework, just like Rails. Oh, did the PHP community rip off Ruby? Are Ruby's mad about it? No. And like, I used to go to conferences. I used to go to PHP conferences and be like, no, I do Ruby. It's okay. And then I go to Ruby conferences like, no, don't be down on these people. Like, I have PHP friends, and it sounded just exactly the way it sounded. Like they're like, I have PHP friends. Yeah. Okay, cool, buddy. But whatever. I mean, it's true. I do have a lot of friends. Like the whole idea was there was this us versus them mentality that was being pushed, and it's still being pushed to a degree. People still, groan when they hear about PHP applications, and we have to kind of get this us versus them philosophy out of our language, out of the way we do things, because even though we don't think that we're blocking people from learning new things, there's lots of perspectives that we can learn from lots of different communities. So let's talk about PHP for a minute. So first of all, I started my coding career in the early 2000s. I mean, okay, so the legal side of my coding career, I started in the 2000s. We can talk about that other stuff later. But PHP was great. Like people were just starting, the .com boom was kind of happening. It was kind of at, the beginning of its implosion, but it's still to this day. That's in the 2000s. We're 21 years later. To this day, the most widely used web development language on the planet, 70% of the applications you see have or use PHP in some form. So if it's so garbage, and if we hate it so much, and if it's dead and no one wants to use it, how is it 70%? Sure, it's not the new sexy anymore, but frankly, it's so widely used that no one's going to knock it off the internet anytime soon. Some folks think that PHP, because it's often used in huge monolithic applications, that it can't do microservice. It's in PHP, it's all just one giant file, right? One giant PHP file. Truthfully, with frameworks and things like that, like this isn't true. Like you might think this if the last thing you used was PHP 4, which means that you're about 15 years behind. But languages grow and change. And we're going to talk about other languages that do that. But like it's completely valid to say, like, I'm going to build a microservices architecture and still build a PHP app and have those two things coincide and work together properly. We have to get over these negative perceptions of the language because it is older. The other thing is that PHP is an interpreted language, so it doesn't have a built-in compiler. The same is true of Ruby and a lot of other languages. Even things like Perl, and I'll get to Perl in a minute. And one of the things that people say is like, oh, PHP is slow. They say this about Ruby too. And this is the thing about slow, is we have a as technologists, very distorted opinion of what slow means. We were having a conversation, Colt and I, at the booth earlier, and he was talking about, he'd gone to see a talk about Postgres, and they were talking about performance and slow indexing and things like that. And when you say like, oh, wow, that query took too long, it took 0.04 microseconds, you can't even have a thought that fast. We're not that good as humans. The numbers that we have to be concerned with are 4 seconds. Does anyone know why it's 4 seconds? Not you, Colton, we already talked about it. 4 seconds is how long someone will wait for your web page to render. After that first 4 seconds, they will click refresh. They will not click refresh a second time. 4 seconds is actually an incredibly long time. Watch this. This is 4 seconds. That was uncomfortable silence. 4 seconds is enough to have an uncomfortable, awkward silence. So if you can render a web page in that, you're doing pretty good. PHP can do that. The next thing, and this again isn't specific to PHP, but is security. There's this perception that applications built in Ruby and PHP lack security. And in reality, these languages are the same as any other language. They are just as secure as you make them. Yes, there are vulnerabilities. Yes, there are things that will come up. Yes, there are attacks that will happen. Yes, there are things that you will have to patch and eventually have to fix. But if you're building with security in mind first, that's not an issue. We need to lessen the perception that it's the fault of the language and kind of put it on ourselves a little bit and say it's the fault of the developer. It's never the code we write. The code doesn't do anything but what we tell it to do. And if we don't tell it to do, it won't do. So this is my one gripe about PHP, though. They're really into these stuffed elephants. Has anybody experienced this in the PHP community? Like, they really love these elephants. I don't get it. Like I felt like when I went to my first PHP conference and they were like, yo, you got to get the green PHP thing because we're in Miami and that's special. I'm like, okay, I'm clearly missing something. I don't know what's going on here. I'm an adult. I don't feel like, I need a stuffed animal at this point in time in my life. If you do, that's cool. But yeah, we got to get rid of that. That's actually not a myth. That's true. That's a weird thing about PHP. The key here is, again, PHP runs 70% of the internet. Sure, it's different flavors of PHP. There's HHVM, there's WordPress, there's Drupal. There's all kinds of different tools that tie into the PHP framework, but it's still PHP at the heart. So we can't sit there and say, well, I'm opinionated and I don't think PHP is valuable, because it's still valuable. We need to get rid of that myth, that perception. So let's talk a little bit about Java, a language that's been dead since I was at least 16 years old, and I'm a lot more than 16 now. This powers the biggest apps available. Most mobile apps are using some form of Java, some mixture of Java. Even React Native is boiling down to Java. Remember that image of the guy that was talking on the phone, or talking to the guy on the airplane, and he's like, I make Ruby apps to tell me where the other guy's like, I wrote the code for this plane. Planes are written in Java. It's just that simple. That's the software that they use. That's a hugely powerful app. That's keeping me in the air. And I'm pretty happy about it because I'd like to stay there for as long as I can until it's time to touch the ground. Java runs a majority of things in the enterprise, like huge, big business things. And they use it to keep things functioning smoothly. Is it an elegant language? Sure. I mean, some people think it is. I would argue that it's not. It depends on what you think you're going to get out of it. But if you're going for pure power and pure compute speed, Java's like super huge, can't be beat. Let's talk about Python for a minute. So Python, when it came out, was very much for academic sciencey stuff, analytics, figuring out things, that could scale, figuring out statistics, mathematical formulas. That's what it was. And that's what a lot of people still think about that today, but it has wider applications. It can be used for so many things like web APIs and, IO stuff. It's actually great with a lot of hardware interfaces. At a previous job that I worked at, we used Python to build an app that allowed us to dole out cash to people and projects that we, the employees, felt were really important. So people could come and say, and we gave them a little Python script, and they would go ahead and push that, and someone would get like $15 a month for their repository. This is before GitHub had the GitHub sponsorship. So like we were able to express our passion through a simple Python script. That's not scientific and it's not academic. It's just love, and you can't quantify that. I have another great example. A few years back, there was a guy called Paul Lemire. He works at Spotify. He gave this great talk about how on Spotify, they use it for data and they figure out your discovery weekly and how you like things. And he explained that all of that came out of a passion project internal to the company where they did a thing called Boil the Frog. Boil the Frog would work like this. You like Taylor Swift. Don't take that personally. This is a royal you. It's definitely not a me. I like Amon Amarth. We all know who Taylor Swift is. How many people actually know who Amon Amarth is? That guy. Knew it'd be that guy. So Amon Amarth is a Viking metal band, and it's exactly what you're picturing in your head. They would say, you've got 10 steps. What are the steps between these bands? And they created a Python script that analyzed the sentiment of the music and the tones that they used to actually look at and say, like, you can connect people between these two bands in less than 10 steps. And I've seen it done, and it's absolutely stunning. And that's not scientific. That has no research value whatsoever. It's a passion project. Python can be used for that. So let's talk about Linux. Has anybody heard of Linux? I believe it's pronounced Linux. It's not a language, but people definitely have perceptions about Linux. It's all netbeards and basement dwellers, right? All gray folks talking about what to do and how to build kernel things and things like that. But how many of you have been on an airplane and something goes wrong with the entertainment system? I know I have. I have seen Tux the Penguin on so many airplanes in my life. It's kind of messed up. How many people have been at the bank and there's some sort of like little issue where they're rebooting Linux? And it's not that Linux isn't good. It's just that, they're still catching up with how the system works, how to bring that into fintech. It's making things that happen that are important. And we all want to do it. We want to have the right tool for the job. Our job as developers is to get things done, be it for our clients, our customers, our business, the great idea that you had at 3 a.m. the other day, whatever, our Bitcoin miners. Like, we want to write things that build. And Linux is something that not only has the wonderful potential to do a lot of things, it has a great community supporting it. Is this the year of the Linux desktop? That's not for this talk. We'll do that some other time. So let's talk about Perl. So a long time ago, you can see this is from 2014. I was working at a company that did Ruby and Rails platform as a service. They're called Engineer. I wrote there in 2014, for some reason, there were all these talks about, is Ruby dead? And someone came out with this response article, is Perl dead or just deader than Ruby? And I was like, wow, mine was a dumb hot take. Yours was dumber. It's a funny reaction. Like, it is funny. I mean, the actual blog post I wrote is Ruby isn't dead, but kind of missed the point. And I don't think Perl is dead either. Not long after I did this, like Christmas came and Larry said, everybody's lucky, you get Perl 6. So after several years of development, Perl 6 came out, and it was an interesting gift. The team building Perl had spent so much time developing it that they wanted to get it right. They'd given up the ghost of fast. And they said, no more will we talk about fast and get things out fast. We want to build them correctly. And when it came out, it was like Half-Life 3 had finally been released. Like, the whole world cheered. And the reasoning behind it was finding imperfections, finding vulnerabilities, finding security flaws, so that the language was easier to use and less cantankerous. Because if you used Perl before 6, oh my God, they made it better. So it wasn't about being fast, because this came out and we're living in the world of like startups and, fail fast and blah, blah, blah. So they're all great sentiments, but at the same time, we have to build things with stability. So again, arguably, Perl's not dead. How many of you use Craigslist? So Perl's pretty cool. It works really well. They could use a designer or two, but that's not my decision. So Jamstack is the future. Everything else sucks. Thank you. Have a good night. The idea here is that this is the new hotness, kinda. And it shouldn't always be about the new hotness. I saw this tweet years ago, and I thought it was pretty funny. Like, attitudes like this are the reason we have imaginary animosity between technology communities. Like, really, like, this didn't even make sense. This was about Swift, and this didn't even make sense to me. So seats are reserved for elderly and pregnant passengers and Objective-C developers. And the idea is Objective-C is obsolete. First of all, what? The fastest, most powerful language on earth? You're telling me that it's no good? Secondly, why are the elderly obsolete? We have so much to learn from them. Let's show a little respect. And of all the things on this slide, pregnant women are obsolete? Now, I'm no biologist, folks, but I'm relatively sure that the continuation of the species develops on making more of us. We kind of need that. That was one of the dumbest things I've ever seen. But these are the attitudes we're fighting against, and they don't stop coming. What we can do is be good community citizens, talk about the things that we're passionate about, or even forget about passion. Just talk about the things that we like, the things that help us do our job, the things that make us happy. This thing happened a few years ago where it was like anything that you could possibly have, you would stick the letters JS on the end of it and release it as a language. I don't know what most of these things do. With the exception of Kraken.js, I do kind of understand. It was something that was built by PayPal to formally bring all of your accounts together under one thing. They eventually built an entirely different company to help that, and it's called Venmo. But like, these things were like popping up in Neckbeard.js. What do you do? Phone.js? What does that mean? And the problem was, it was like, JavaScript is ubiquitous. And I get that. We can't build our applications without JavaScript. We can't. It's just the way the world decided to do things. And I can't fight that. I don't love JavaScript because I've told many people, I can build you a web application. I can build you a mobile application, but it's going to be a white background with black text. It's probably going to be Times New Roman because I do not make good decisions when it comes to colors or design or schemes or fonts. I make things work. And I'll get more into that when we talk about design. But the idea here is just because something's the new hotness doesn't mean that it's a good thing. And I could go on about language. There's so many more languages. There's, Golang and Rust and Elixir. And I talked about HHVM a little bit, and there's Scala and Erlang. Some of these languages are old. Some of them are new. But all of them offer a different experience and a different perspective. And it's these perspectives that actually inform us when we come back to the thing that we do for work every day and help us to learn how we can do things better. Some of these languages are compiled. Some of them are not. Elixir is based on Erlang. Erlang is based on phone switching, like literal landline telephones. But there's so much we can learn from that language and how we can actually develop it. It's something we need to learn. We need to look at these perspectives and learn. It's not about being with it. We want to avoid that hipsterist BS and see that we want to find a thing. It's also not about clinging to a thing that's old and faded because it's dependable and holding on to that forever. But it's also not about saying, well, this is the brand new thing, so I have to jump on it immediately. Evolution is important. If we become stagnant, it's the biggest way to guarantee things will fail. Point of fact, in the world of DevOps, we started on bare metal. For those of us who remember, some of us started pre-bare metal. Like it wasn't even metal. It was an old Dell that wasn't being used anymore that we stuck ISS on in a closet with some Cat5 cable. And maybe if we were lucky, a fan that oscillated. It was hot, it was dangerous. And if your website fell down or someone tripped over a cord, your entire application was gone. We've come so far. We're 100% cloud now. Well, not 100%. There's actually a big movement in the bare metal community to come back to bare metal, to have these optional servers because it's easier to build them. They're safer, better structured, and you're not sticking it in a closet and hoping for the best. There's lots of ways to leverage these things. There's AWS and Google, and there's private clouds and public clouds, and it all started because we had pain points and we needed local servers, but that wasn't good enough. Then we had co-locations, and each step of the way, our infrastructure evolved. Our coding languages and communities can evolve the same way. I love communities. There are so many communities. We could call ourselves, just being in this room, we could call this the PJ Talk community or the greater ATO community, the Raleigh Tech community, whatever, the open source community. There's lots of things. But the problem, and I think this graphic always illustrates this perfectly. Lots of communities, but each one of them is separate and equal. And we all know what kind of a trigger phrase that is. They're not mingling. This is the issue, the big problem. We all live in these glass houses and we love to throw stones. We love it. And it's kind of got to stop. I don't mean to rant, but we got to kind of stop and bring things together. So these are some things I've heard people say in my travels. I've been doing DevRel for about 11 or 12 or a million years. I don't know. And I like to go through each one of them because I find them interesting. Designers aren't developers. They shouldn't be at hardcore tech meetups. First of all, I don't know what the hell hardcore tech means. If you're building robots or AI, maybe that's more hardcore than me building web applications. I don't know. But as I said before, I can't really do CSS. I'm not really good at it. Part of the reason why I've been married for 21 years is because I don't know how to match my shirt with my pants. And so I found a woman who would help me with that. But in all seriousness, without a designer, a lot of our web applications wouldn't go anywhere. You have to capture that zeitgeist. You have to get someone to look at it. You have to understand the beauty of the thing that you're trying to tell them. This is one of my favorites from a very dear friend of mine. Sysadmins can live without developers. What do we need them for? Now, this is when I was working at that platform as a service, and I looked him dead in the eye. We were both in the support team, and I was like, what do we need sysadmins for if no one builds an application? What are you serving? What's on the server? What do we do? And it was something born out of frustration because sometimes developers can be a little finicky and sometimes they can be prima donnas and they're 10x and they're so awesome. And it built up a little bit of anti-rapport, whatever that real word is. And so he said this out of frustration, and I got it. I totally understand. But then he started to spend time with developers and he realized the value in learning their perceptions, learning the way that they look at things, their perspective. It's key. Business folks just don't get developers. We're all getting paid, right? So someone at the business end of things is figuring things out, because I don't do any of that stuff. And my favorite is tech people are socially inept, all of them. I like to consider myself fairly well versed socially. I like to talk to people. I like to go to karaoke parties. I like to come to conferences and hear about people from all parts of the world and see what they're doing. If that's socially inept, then I don't understand what society is. This is an idea that needs to be done away with it. Just because we're open source developer doesn't mean we're all a bunch of nerds living in our basements trying to feed our cats. That's not the way it works. We need cross-pollination. We need to expose ourselves to more things. We need to get people to leave their little niches. You know, part of that is actually reaching out, and it's been tough. This past year and a half has been tough to do this because you have to do it even more actively. But you know what? If you're, you're an open source developer and maybe you focus mostly on backend stuff, join the Mattermost server and talk to us about Golang. Talk to our developers. They'll hang out and talk to you. They're happy to share their knowledge. If you don't know much about design, go to a UI UX meetup. They're online. You don't have to leave your house. Just wear a shirt. Don't even have to know that you're still wearing your pajama pants. It's totally fine. These are the things we have to expose ourselves in order to get this cross-pollination, to understand how things are different. That's how we build a tech community, a greater tech community. Tech community is often used as kind of like, a catch-all phrase, but it doesn't really accurately depict what's going on. There's so many communities underneath that, but we can really start to bring people together. We can start to see where we connect as people in the things that we do. And it's not just the languages, it's not the philosophies of agile versus waterfall versus DevOps. It's about understanding where we can connect, where we can collaborate, where we can build better things, because that's really the idea, right? All of our companies probably, all the people you work for always have like some mission statement that it usually says making someone's life better. Wasn't part of making life better learning new things and building new things and being excited about what other people are doing? Isn't building a better society part of making life better? So ruminate on that a bit. Finally, we get to the most contentious part of our talk. The dichotomy, or perceived dichotomy, between open source software and the enterprise. Or really, here I'm using enterprise as a catch-all for any non-open source software, any non-open source company. How many people here are open source developers? Cool. And how many are not? Cool. How many of us that are open source developers haven't always been? I know I started off doing, this is embarrassing. It's going to show my age. I was a Visual Fox Pro developer. Hi, my name is PJ, and I'm sorry. And you clap because you know my pain. It was terrible. But I did enterprise development for a long time. And I discovered open source, and I was lucky enough to find a job in it. And it was really super awesome. And it was interesting to see how that perception changed the way I thought about things, changed the way I did things, because I had the enterprise mentality still that leaked over into the open source. So let's go back to this for a second. Let's talk about how people perceive open source developers. I kind of said it earlier. They're shaggy. They live in San Francisco, or they're all West Coast. It doesn't have to be San Francisco, but they're all on the West Coast. They make useless crap apps. Or they live in their mom's basements. They scrape together Linux packages for internet fame while chatting on Reddit. And they try to hope that they get enough money donated to their GitHub so they can feed their 40 cats. Accurate depiction of an open source developer, right? That's what everybody thinks. Then, of course, there's the enterprise developer. Ha, business. Enterprise developers are only focused on money. Their perception is that they are toiling cogs in a gray cube factory making software for people who are toiling in other gray cube factories, or they're a well-heeled group of go-getters who are after that cash prize. But maybe the poor downtrodden open source developer is just as bad as the concept of the earning so much cube dweller. There's a lot about organization, general usefulness that the open source community can learn from enterprise developers. Just simple code styling, simple things. When I first started in open source, version control was not a thing. Git was just starting to catch on. GitHub did not exist. Some people were using this thing called Subversion or SVN, but it wasn't that great. And you really were just committing to trunk and hoping nothing conflicted with the guy sitting next to you. Enterprise development was focused on SVN. They didn't have Git yet. They weren't quite there, but they understood the value of having code repositories outside of the machines that everyone was using. The value of having someone who was in charge of merging conflicts so you didn't have to do it yourself. That's something you can get in an enterprise structured format. When I joined the open source community, there were lots of talks about the craft, the artisanal craft of developing and being a programmer creatively. And this is one of the things that I loved about the Ruby community, because Ruby is, they call it convention over configuration. So the idea is you were going to focus on building the thing you wanted to build. And there are some rules that you can bend, and there's some rules you can break. And you can do it, and it's up to you. We're going to say, this is the way we recommend that you do it. This is the best practice. You don't have to. We recommend it. And that's how the idea of code as crafts kind of started to grow. Open source developers love it. But from that, they started to develop this idea like, oh, we're so unique. We're so special because we're open source developers who create these artisanal craft applications. And we're not unique. We're building things for other people. If we think of ourselves as unique, we're missing the point of building a community. I often say at Mattermost with my community team, we don't expect the community to come to us. We have to go to the community. It's never about the individual. And it's the same with our code. When we write code, we can't think that we're writing this for ourselves or so that some next programmer comes along and thinks that they're like, oh, that was clever, or, oh, these are the right tests, or, oh, that was kind of cool. It's not for them. We build applications for other people that we might never see. And those are the people that we have to have empathy for. We have to see the value of in order to become better at what we do for a living. It's just enough to have a different view and hopefully the desire to share that view with others. That's a start, but you also have to listen to what others have to say. And we should do it for the children. So what else? So part of the point of this talk was to point out that there's flaws in our logic as developers. We as people, and this might be harsh, but try to take this, kindly. We tend to inflate our own interests until things grow way out of proportion. This is especially true in the tech community. We try to be useful for about 50, 60 years, and then we move on. We go somewhere else. I'm not here for that metaphysical conversation. And here I'm ignoring the teenage years when, let's be honest, we weren't that useful. But like this whole concept of being disruptive or difficult or a prima donna or a 10x developer or super special or I'm so amazing and I'm so awesome, it's got to stop, because what it does is puts up walls. And you might say, well, yeah, maybe it puts up walls with the people around me, but what it actually does is the people who aren't around you. So as I mentioned, and as is painfully obvious, I'm a slightly chubby, bearded guy in a hat. I'm a white guy. I come with a certain amount of privilege, and I understand that. I've tried to come to terms with it, but it's not easy. It's difficult because you have to learn that you have biases, and you have to learn that you got a whole bunch of stuff for free. So you start there. And then when you start seeing the walls that are being put up, you realize those walls weren't for you. Those walls were for everyone who doesn't look like you, everyone who doesn't think like you, everyone who didn't grow up like you. And those are the people we have to knock the walls down for. So the big idea here is not just figure out a language in a community you're comfortable with. It's see how you can bring more people in there. And I love everybody. I think everybody's great. I think everybody brings a unique perspective to the table. I don't care identity, background, like somebody's got some story to tell and I want to hear it. But we spent so much time in the tech community talking about how freaking awesome we are that we don't focus on how awesome we can make others. So if you're doing something that no one else does, that is great. But be realistic. When we see words tossed around, like sometimes it's very difficult to get over them. I've had so many job applications or job requests. LinkedIn is a nightmare, by the way, in case anybody doesn't know, that place is a horror show. But so many people asking me to be a ninja or a rock star or a wizard. Why is that a thing? I mean, I was a musician for a long time. I know what rock stardom looks like. And, it's playing a room with 3,000 people chanting your name and singing your songs along with you. This ain't that. Ninjas probably don't exist, but because they're invisible, I can't be 100% sure on that one. Because maybe if they're really good at their jobs, I'll just never find out. And there are no wizards, probably. I mean, I don't care how long I grow my beard. It's not going to happen. I can't do music. I can do music. I can't do magic. So forget the legends. Forget the myths about who you are, what you do. Do the best you can do to be cool with everyone around you, everyone you meet, everyone you interact with, everyone you talk to. Help new people get into this game, get into developing, get into the tech community. There's so much fun stuff to do that I really think there's a spot for absolutely everyone all across the table. and get rid of all this surrounding bullshit. I don't know if I'm allowed to swear. Sorry if I swore, but the surrounding BS. And eventually, like all these urban legends will start to disappear. They'll just start to go away and the tech community will become better. Thank you very much. I am happy to take any questions. I think we have a few minutes. Did someone just whistle? How did you whistle with a mask on? That's magical. Yes. I didn't catch the last part. Oh yeah, absolutely. One of the biggest things that I've found to be successful is when I learn something and I really internalize it and I start to, really incorporate that into things that I do. The first thing I need to do is find out somebody who wants to do that and can't. And then I mentor them. That's one of the biggest things is because a lot of people say, oh, well, I can't get a job being a programmer because I've never programmed before. Okay, cool. So let's start with that. Let's get you into, some free programs. Let's work on some simple things. I will send you some books, whatever. Let's get you started. Or I've had a lot of people that have come to me and said, wow, you're a tech speaker? That must be crazy. I would love to do that. Cool. I will show you how to do that. That is surprisingly the easiest thing in the world. The hardest part is finding like all the cool pictures for your slides. But it's all about, like this is all about finding something that you really want to talk about and talking about it. And plus no one else can talk back when you're talking because you have a microphone. It's really cool. But that's the biggest thing. Figure out what it is that you're doing that you can teach someone else to do. And it's probably more than you think. When I first started doing Ruby, I'd been working at the company. We built academic software and we're using Visual Fox Pro. Microsoft end-of-lifed it. And I was like, oh crap. So the head of development was like, well, Postgres functions like the functionality of Fox Pro as far as queries, and Ruby works well with so go learn Ruby. And I'm like, yeah, I don't have time for that. I'm a dad. But so we hired a team and I was like, I have nothing to show these people. Like they all came in and they were like really cool Ruby developers. I'm like, shit, I feel useless. But the way it actually turned out was I had all the domain knowledge of the applications we were building. So I could show them the functionality of our like course eval system and show them how we ran surveys and how we built them. And they would teach me the Ruby to build the same thing. And we had this exchange of knowledge. Fast forward a couple of years, we're now a full Ruby shop and we hire someone new. And I'm like, well, we'll give them to Mark because Mark's always the one that trains people. And Mark was like, no, we're giving them to you. And I'm like, what? But I'm barely a Rubyist. I'm just some guy. And I found that sharing that knowledge, like I knew so much more than I thought I did. And it was such an amazingly rewarding experience for me and for the person learning because I was happy to share it. And the key with that is, again, find people who don't look like me to do that. We have white guys with beards. I'm sorry. I know there's a few of us in the room. It's easy for us to get our resources and we can find mentors everywhere. Find someone who doesn't look like me. Help them get onboarded. Help them to tear down the wall. It's the only way we can do it. Any other questions? It's cool if you don't have questions. We're like reaching the end of the conference. So don't feel bad that you didn't have questions. If you want to get a hold of me, you have any comments, questions, you'd like to talk about my wonderful hat, whatever, I'm at a splenic on Twitter. There's a whole story about that. I'm happy to share it, but I don't have a spleen. Feel free to stop by at the Mattermost booth. We can talk about developer collaboration and how communication is really the most important thing to bringing developers into a community, into a job place, and how communication is the thing that actually makes the world go round. And with that, thank you again so much for being here. I really appreciate it.